My unfaithful wife asked why I was packing my bags, so I told her I was done unpacking all her lies. When I finally left her because of her constant deception, she begged me to stay. Sup Reddit. My name is Tyler, and I'm 29 years old. This is the story of how my marriage ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a door that somehow felt more final than any scream ever could. The door didn't creak when I closed it behind me that evening. It clicked with a finality that sounded like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't meant to write. Outside, the wind was unusually quiet for a Miami evening. There was no dramatic thunderstorm brewing, no doors slamming in the distance, no neighbors screaming at each other across the courtyard. Just the sound of my own heartbeat, which felt dull and mechanical, as if it no longer belonged to me. Victoria was sitting at our dining table when I walked in, positioned exactly as I'd expected to find her. She was wearing that gray sweater she always claimed made her feel sophisticated, the one she'd pull on whenever she wanted to project an image of effortless elegance. Her laptop was open in front of her, but she wasn't typing. Instead, she was sipping white wine from one of our good glasses, sitting with one leg crossed elegantly over the other. She was barefoot, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Her toenails were painted crimson red. Victoria had never painted her nails that color before. In fact, she'd always told me she hated crimson with a passion, calling it cheap and trashy. She preferred subtle pinks or clear polish, colors that whispered rather than shouted. But here she was, sporting this bold red that seemed to announce something I wasn't ready to hear. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to, hoping something inside me would provide a script, tell me what to say or how to say it. But all I had was this hollow, dry-chested feeling and a memory that had been playing in my head on repeat for the past 3 days. Victoria laughing, not at something I had said, not with me, not even around me. Just laughing somewhere I didn't belong, in a moment I wasn't supposed to see. Finally, I found my voice. "Why are you wearing that color?" She didn't look up from her wine glass. "What color?" "Crimson." Her gaze lifted slowly, and when our eyes met, there was no guilt in her expression. Just that calm, bored look she used when she thought I was overreacting about something trivial, like leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting to replace the toilet paper. "Oh," she said with a slight shrug. "It's just polish." She took another sip of wine and added almost casually, "You're home early." I didn't answer her observation. Instead, I walked past her, through our hallway and into the bedroom we'd shared for the past 3 years. I opened the closet and pulled down the suitcase I hadn't touched since our trip to Key West last summer. She didn't follow me at first, which somehow felt worse than if she had. I unzipped the suitcase and started folding shirts with deliberate precision. Nothing felt rushed or frantic. I moved methodically, counting each item as I placed it inside. 1, 2, 3. Just like any other laundry day, except my hands were trembling and I couldn't feel my face. That's when I heard her footsteps behind me. "What are you doing?" I kept folding, kept placing things in the suitcase with mechanical precision. I couldn't look at her yet. Not until I said what needed to be said. "Why are you packing?" she asked, and I could hear a note of genuine curiosity in her voice, as if this were an intellectual puzzle rather than the end of our marriage. I turned finally, gripping the suitcase handle like it was an anchor keeping me steady in rough waters. I looked her right in the eye and said the words I'd been rehearsing for 3 days. "Because I'm done unpacking your lies." Her face didn't crack when I said those words. It didn't even twitch. She simply blinked once, tilted her head slightly to the side, and I watched that little smirk begin to twitch at the edge of her lip. "Dramatic," she said, her tone carrying that familiar, condescending edge I'd somehow learned to tolerate over the years. I nodded slowly, still gripping the suitcase handle. That's one word for it. Victoria had always been exceptionally good at maintaining her composure. She could lie through her teeth while stirring cream into her morning coffee, her face betraying nothing. She could walk into a room knowing that 3 people in it absolutely hated her, and somehow make them leave thinking they were the villains in whatever story she was telling herself. That was Victoria unbothered ice, smooth and impenetrable. But even ice cracks if you press hard enough, and I was about to apply some serious pressure. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen a few times with deliberate slowness, and turned it toward her. On the display was a screenshot, an Instagram story from her friend Jessica from 3 nights ago. It showed a rooftop party in full swing, the camera panning right in a quick, casual motion. Most people wouldn't have noticed what I caught in those few frames. It wasn't meant to be the focus of the shot. But there, in the corner of the frame, barely visible but unmistakably clear, was my wife Victoria kissing someone I didn't recognize. The image showed his hand wrapped around her neck, her body pressed against him with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't their first moment together. She looked like she belonged there, like his touch was something she'd grown accustomed to, something she welcomed. I said nothing as I held the screen between us. I just let the evidence speak for itself. She looked at the phone, then looked at me, her expression remaining frustratingly neutral. Then she walked calmly to the dresser, picked up her wine glass again, and took another measured sip. "You saw a kiss," she said with that same infuriating calm. "Not a confession." "You're not even denying it," I pointed out, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. She shrugged, a gesture so casual it felt like a slap. "What's the point?" And that response, that complete lack of fight, that absolute absence of panic or remorse, hit me harder than anything else could have. The shrug told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't caught off guard because she'd already been living in the after, and I was just now catching up to where she'd been for months. "You really want to blow everything up over a kiss?" she added, raising her glass slightly as if toasting the absurdity of my reaction. My voice came back thick and low when I finally responded. "It wasn't a kiss. It was betrayal." She raised her glass higher, almost in a mock toast. "Potato, potato!" I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone across the room. I didn't break down and cry. Instead, I just zipped the suitcase with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room and pulled it upright, ready to leave. "Where are you going?" she asked, and her voice was light, almost amused, like this was all some elaborate game she was winning. I looked around the room one last time. Our room, with our framed photo from Barcelona still hanging on the wall, the vanilla-scented candle she'd bought because it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, the throw blanket I'd always hated but kept anyway because it made her happy. All these little pieces of a life we'd built together, now feeling like props in a play I'd never auditioned for. "I don't know yet," I said, meeting her eyes one final time. "But I sure as hell know where I'm not staying." She didn't follow me as I walked toward the door. She didn't plead with me to stay, didn't chase after me with explanations or apologies. She just refilled her wine glass and settled back into her chair. And when the door clicked shut behind me, for what I knew would be the last time, I swear I heard her laugh, not with relief or hysteria, but with something that sounded almost like satisfaction. I slept in my car that night, with the leather seat leaned all the way back and my jacket serving as a makeshift blanket. I kept the engine off because I didn't want to waste gas, and besides, July in Miami isn't cold. But the silence, the complete, suffocating silence, can make your bones feel like winter, regardless of the temperature outside. I had parked outside a 24-hour diner on Ocean Drive, one of those places that stays lit up all night like a beacon for insomniacs and broken hearts. I stared through the windshield for hours, watching the occasional late-night wanderer pass by, as if the glass owed me answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask yet. My phone buzzed twice around midnight. It wasn't her. I think part of me had been hoping it would be, that she'd come to her senses and call with some explanation that would make everything make sense again. Instead, it was Nathan, my best friend since 4th grade. He'd seen the message I'd sent him an hour earlier. "Can I crash at yours tomorrow?" His reply was exactly what I needed. "Doors open, beer's cold. You good?" I stared at that message for a long time before realizing I couldn't answer it honestly. Was I good? No, I wasn't good. I was something else entirely. Something sour and splintered that I didn't have a name for yet. There's this thing that happens when the person who knows all your soft spots, who's supposed to protect them, is the one who slices into them without even blinking. I wasn't hurt in the usual sense that people talk about after breakups. This was deeper than that, like a dislocation in the soul. You go to stand up and realize something doesn't fit where it used to, that some fundamental part of your internal architecture has shifted, and you're not sure if it can ever be put back the right way. Victoria and I had always had what you might call a quiet kind of relationship. We weren't the loud lovers you see making out in restaurant booths or having screaming matches in grocery store parking lots. We didn't do public displays of affection in front of strangers or post constant couple photos on social media. Our love was more subdued, more private. But that made the betrayal hit even harder somehow. You don't expect fire when everything's always been ice, and you certainly don't expect the ice to shatter so easily in someone else's hands. Even as I sat there in that car, surrounded by the ambient noise of a city that never really sleeps, I kept trying to logic my way through what had happened. Maybe it really was just a kiss, I told myself. Maybe they were both drunk and got caught up in a moment that didn't mean anything. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she was going through something I didn't understand. But no, The moment didn't explain her face when I confronted her. It didn't explain the way she looked at me like I was the idiot, like I was the one who had messed up by caring too much. It didn't explain those crimson nails or the complete absence of guilt in her eyes. I kept thinking about her fingers trailing down his jacket in that Instagram frame. How natural and familiar the gesture looked. I thought about those nails painted a color she'd always claimed to hate. I thought about that half-laugh in her throat when she said, "What's the point?" in response to my accusation. That wasn't guilt. That wasn't panic or fear of getting caught. That was apathy, pure and simple. And apathy, I was learning, is infinitely worse than anger. Anger means you still care enough to fight. Apathy means you've already moved on, that the other person has become irrelevant to your emotional landscape. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up with a stiff neck and the sun burning through the windshield like an interrogation lamp. The digital clock on my dashboard read 7:12 a.m., and there was a text message waiting for me. Victoria, we should talk. 3 words. No question mark, no apology, no sense of desperation or urgency. Just, we should talk, like she was scheduling a routine dentist appointment or reminding me to pick up dry cleaning. I stared at those words for several minutes, then turned on the ignition without responding. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove aimlessly for about 40 minutes, letting the morning traffic and the familiar streets of Miami wash over me like white noise. Eventually, my car seemed to find its own way toward Nathan's place, as if even my subconscious knew where I needed to be. Nathan lived in a loft apartment above a record shop in one of those converted buildings that used to house a coffee roastery. The place still carried the lingering sense of vinyl records and burnt espresso, a combination that had always felt comforting to me in the past. When I walked through his door that morning, he didn't bombard me with questions or awkward small talk. He just handed me a cold beer and nodded toward the couch, understanding instinctively that I needed space to process rather than pressure to explain. I sat down heavily, but I didn't touch the drink. It felt too early for alcohol, even though part of me wanted to dive into anything that might numb the edges of what I was feeling. She cheat? Nathan asked after a few minutes of comfortable silence. Yeah, I said, the word coming out flat and matter-of-fact. He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times over the years when he was processing difficult information. You catch her? Yeah. What did she say? I stared at the hardwood floor, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight streaming through his windows. She said, potato, potato. Nathan's eyebrows shot up, and he let out a low whistle that somehow perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. Cold. Yeah. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention that only comes from decades of friendship. So what now? That was the question, wasn't it? I really didn't know what came next. There was still this pathetically hopeful part of me that kept expecting my phone to ring, expecting Victoria to call back with some explanation that would make it all make sense. Something that would explain away the crimson nails, the Instagram frame, that dismissive shrug. But deep down, beneath all the desperate rationalization and wishful thinking, I knew the truth. There wasn't going to be a tearful confession. There wasn't going to be a sobbing apology where she begged for forgiveness and promised to change. Victoria wasn't built that way. She was too controlled, too calculating. She was probably going to move on emotionally before the dust from our relationship had even settled, if she hadn't already. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized that maybe I needed to learn how to do the same thing. Maybe I needed to stop waiting for closure that would never come and start figuring out how to move forward on my own terms. I didn't text Victoria back that day, or the next day, or the day after that. Nathan let me crash on his couch for the rest of the week without asking questions or setting timelines. He seemed to understand that I needed time to just exist in the wreckage for a while before I could start cleaning it up. I buried myself in work emails, spreadsheets, and client presentations. Anything that would keep my mind occupied and prevent me from spiraling into obsessive thoughts about what Victoria was doing or who she was with. But lies have a way of rotting in silence. They don't just disappear when you try to ignore them. Instead, they sit there festering in the dark corners of your mind, growing more toxic until they eventually push their way to the surface. And Victoria's lies, all of them that I was only beginning to understand, they pushed hard. It was Thursday night when everything came to a head. I'd just gotten back from a grocery run, picking up basic necessities like eggs and instant noodles, stuff I didn't even want, but bought anyway because it made me feel like I was still capable of taking care of myself. I was unpacking the bags when my phone lit up with an incoming call. Victoria. I stared at the screen for what felt like 45 seconds, watching her name flash and disappear and flash again. Then, almost without conscious decision, I picked up. "Hey," I said, my voice completely flat and emotionless. "Tyler," she breathed. And for the first time since this whole mess started, her voice sounded different. It didn't have that usual controlled confidence. Instead, it sounded almost fragile, like she didn't have complete control over the conversation anymore. "Can we meet?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately, which seemed to make her nervous. She continued, words tumbling out faster than her usual measured pace. "Please, just one conversation. I'll come to you wherever you want. I owe you that." The word "owe" scratched at something raw inside me, something I hadn't even realized was there. "Fine," I said after a long pause. 25 minutes, corner of Biscayne and Flagler. Don't be late." I hung up before she could respond. I didn't tell Nathan where I was going. I didn't want to hear a lecture about closure or moving on. I just grabbed my keys and walked to the meeting spot early, positioning myself near a light pole across from a bakery that had already closed for the evening. The sky was turning that deep purple color that Miami gets just before full darkness sets in, and the clouds were moving slowly overhead, like even they didn't want to rush this conversation that had been inevitable since the moment I walked out of our apartment. She showed up wearing a black coat, her hair down and loose around her shoulders, her face completely bare of makeup. That was new. Victoria always wore something, even if it was just mascara and lip gloss. She wouldn't even go to bed without at least some basic foundation on. Seeing her face this naked and unguarded made me feel a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. Almost. "Thanks for coming," she said as she approached, her voice softer than I'd heard it in months. I said nothing, just stood there waiting for whatever performance she'd prepared. She sighed deeply, the kind of exhale that suggested she was carrying a weight she was finally ready to put down. "Look, I messed up." "That's a start," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She nodded, biting her lower lip in a gesture I recognized from the early days of our relationship, back when she used to get nervous about things that actually mattered to her. "It wasn't planned. The rooftop party that night. I was drunk." She paused, then added with brutal honesty, "Yeah, but I wasn't that drunk. And I'm not going to insult you by saying I didn't know what I was doing." "That's a shame," I said. "Would have been easier to hear than the truth." She looked down at her feet, and I could see her struggling to find words that didn't exist in any script she'd rehearsed. "You want the truth?" I folded my arms across my chest. That would be a first. She looked up then, and there it was. That familiar Victoria expression, but cracked now, with something that looked like fear creeping in around the edges. I was bored. The word hit me like ice water filling my lungs. Bored. Of all the reasons I'd imagined, of all the explanations I'd tortured myself with, boredom had never even made the list. "I didn't cheat because I stopped loving you," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in this confession. "I cheated because I stopped feeling anything at all." I just blinked, trying to process what she was telling me. She kept going, words pouring out now like she'd been holding them back for months. "You're steady. You're safe. You always were. You were the guy I could build a life with. The one who would never hurt me, or disappoint me, or leave me wondering where I stood." She took a shaky breath. "But somewhere in the middle of brunches and movie nights and folding towels together, I stopped feeling alive." "Didn't realize I was your coma," I said, and the bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "Don't!" she snapped, some of her old fire returning. "Don't make this a joke!" "You made it a joke the moment you let him kiss you," I shot back. Silence stretched between us like a chasm, and then she said something I never expected to hear. "It wasn't just once." Of course it wasn't. My hands tightened into fists, not out of rage but from the effort of restraining myself. I didn't want to yell or scream or give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "How long?" I asked. 7 months, she said quietly. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 7 months. So basically a third of our entire marriage had been built on lies. A third of our shared meals, shared bed, shared future plans, all of it happening while she was living a completely different life behind my back. "It wasn't like that," she started. "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't finish that sentence. Don't you dare paint this as some inevitable breakdown that just happened to us. You had a choice. Every single day for 7 months, you chose to betray me." She stepped closer and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "I didn't come here to fix things. I know I broke it too far for that. I didn't want to leave without saying something real. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her. Then say something real. Not poetic, not tragic, just real. She swallowed hard, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You deserved better. I nodded slowly. I know. She looked like she wanted to reach out and touch my arm, to bridge the gap between us with some kind of physical gesture. I stepped back before she could try. This is goodbye, Victoria, I said with finality. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears that I no longer had any interest in witnessing. So that's it? I stared at her. This woman I'd shared a bed with for 3 years, whose coffee preferences I knew by heart, whose moods I could read from across a room. Yeah, I said. That's it. Then I turned and walked away, not allowing myself to look back even once. The truth is, when someone shows you they've been building a new world without you in it, the only real response is to leave them in that world and start building your own. You'd think the end of a marriage would come with fireworks or some kind of final dramatic scene, something cinematic that you could replay later and say, that's when it all burned down. But that's not how real endings work. Real endings are quiet, awkward, and unsatisfying. They don't sound like thunder crashing or orchestra swelling. They sound like nothing at all. I didn't talk to Victoria again after that night on the corner of Biscayne and Flagler. She didn't text me, didn't call, didn't send any emails. There were no fake emergencies involving the bank or the dog or some misplaced bill that would give her an excuse to keep the thread of communication going between us. She just vanished from my life as completely as if she'd flipped a switch in her head and erased me from her memory. It was like I had become a misstep in her life story rather than a memory worth preserving. And that's what really stuck with me in the days that followed. Not the kiss I'd seen in that Instagram story, not the lies she'd told, not even the 7 months of secret meetings with whatever pathetic excuse of a man was desperate enough to think that stealing someone's wife was some kind of prize. What haunted me was the clean, surgical silence that followed our final conversation. The complete absence of any acknowledgement that I had ever mattered to her at all. 3 days after our meeting, I decided it was time to go back to the apartment and collect the rest of my belongings. Nathan came with me. Not because I asked him to, but because he showed up at my door with 2 cups of coffee and a crowbar. Just in case, he said with a grim smile. The place felt smaller when I walked back into it, though I couldn't tell if that was psychological or if Victoria had actually moved things around. The couch was positioned differently than I remembered, angled toward the window instead of facing the television. The painting I'd bought her for our 4th anniversary, the abstract piece she'd said tied the whole room together, was gone from the wall, leaving behind a slightly discolored rectangle where it had hung. So were all traces of me. My jackets were missing from the closet. My slippers were nowhere to be found. Even my toothbrush had been removed from the bathroom holder. There wasn't a single indication that I'd ever lived in that space, not even the lingering scent of my cologne in the air. Victoria had erased my presence with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been planning this cleanup for much longer than the few days since our confrontation. You okay? Nathan asked, as he watched me stand in the middle of what used to be our living room. I bent down and picked up a framed photograph from the end table. A picture of Victoria and me at a beach house we'd rented 2 summers ago. In the photo, I was holding her hand, and she was looking at me like I was the only man in the world who mattered. I stared at that image for a moment, then placed the frame face down on the table and left it there. Let's get this over with, I said. The whole process took exactly 27 minutes. I kept track because every second spent inside that apartment felt like suffocating on drywall dust. Nathan packed boxes with mechanical efficiency while I moved slowly through the rooms, my hands seeming to forget what belonged to me and what didn't. When we were finished, I left my keys on the kitchen counter without ceremony. I didn't write a note or take one last look around. There was nothing left to look at. Victoria had made it crystal clear that this wasn't my home anymore. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was long and silent. Nathan stared at the floor the entire time, and he didn't speak until we reached the lobby. She's a ghost, man, he said quietly. Dead to you. Remember that. I nodded, wanting desperately to believe him. We loaded the boxes into the trunk of my car, and during the drive back to Nathan's place, I spent the entire time looking out the passenger window. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold through a screen, like I was just some background extra in a movie that was being recast without my knowledge. Back at Nathan's apartment, I unpacked only what I absolutely needed: a toothbrush, 2 shirts, and 1 pair of jeans. I couldn't bring myself to touch the rest of my belongings. They still carried the scent of the life I'd lost, and I wasn't ready to face that yet. That night, I tried to sleep but found myself lying awake with my eyes closed, replaying that rooftop scene over and over again. I kept seeing that blurry frame from the Instagram story, the side of Victoria's face caught in the corner of the shot, her mouth pressed against someone else's jaw. Her hands had looked so confident in that moment, so familiar with his body. She wasn't confused or uncertain in that image. She wasn't sorry. She was already gone, had been gone long before I ever walked out of our apartment. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped hoping she would come back. I stopped waiting for the phone call where she would break down and beg for forgiveness. Stopped imagining scenarios where she would realize what she'd lost and fight to get me back. Everyone talks about grief coming in stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But nobody tells you that those stages don't come in neat, orderly packages. They twist around each other like tangled Christmas lights, overlapping and contradicting until you can't tell which emotion you're supposed to be feeling at any given moment. One minute I felt fine, rational, and steady, telling myself that this breakup was for the best and that I dodged a bullet. The next minute, I'd catch a whiff of her shampoo in a grocery store aisle and feel like someone had dropped a concrete block on my chest. The unpredictability of it was almost worse than the pain itself. I started working longer hours at the office, volunteering for anything that would keep me busy and out of my own head. I took on late-night shifts, client calls that ran past normal business hours, and inventory reports that nobody else wanted to handle. I even offered to cover for Marcus, a coworker with 2 kids who was always struggling to balance his schedule, just so I wouldn't have to sit alone in Nathan's apartment at night, wondering if Victoria had brought Kevin. Yeah, I'd finally found out his name into our bed yet. And then came the message that changed everything. It was a Wednesday afternoon, right after lunch. I was in the office break room stirring sugar into what had to be my 5th cup of black coffee that day when I felt my phone buzz against my leg. I pulled it out, expecting to see a work email or maybe a text from Nathan. Instead, there was a message from an unknown number with no contact name attached. Heard you moved out. Didn't take you for a runner. K? I stared at the screen like it was displaying some kind of elaborate joke. K. Kevin. That smug, single-syllable piece of garbage had the absolute nerve to text me directly. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had he wrecked my marriage by pursuing my wife, but now he wanted to poke at the wreckage like it was some kind of sport. I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to unleash every curse word I knew, but because I realized that any reaction would be giving him exactly what he wanted. He was trying to provoke me, trying to get me to lose control so he could paint me as the unhinged ex-husband. If I responded, he would win this pathetic little game he was playing. But silence doesn't mean peace, and that message turned my brain completely inside out for the rest of the day. How had he gotten my phone number? Why would he reach out to me at all? What kind of parasitic human being not only destroys someone else's relationship, but then tries to antagonize the victim afterward? I spent the entire remainder of my workday imagining what it would feel like to punch him. Not yelling at him or confronting him with words, just one clean hit to the jaw. No conversation, no explanation, just pure physical consequences for his actions. That was the fantasy that kept playing in my head. But real life doesn't work like that. Real life makes you sit in your car after your shift ends, staring at your phone screen as it lights up again with Victoria's name. This time it was a voicemail. I listened to it twice, analyzing every inflection in her voice. She sounded tired, not sad or emotional, just drained, like someone who'd been dealing with a persistent headache all day. "Hey," her voice said through the speaker. "I didn't give him your number. I want you to know that. I'm sorry he did that. I'll block him if you want. Anyway, just wanted to say that. No, I miss you. No, let's talk about us." Just a cleanup call. She wanted to control the narrative, to make sure I understood that Kevin's text wasn't part of some coordinated campaign against me. She'd always been obsessed with controlling how situations were perceived, and even now, even after everything that had happened, she couldn't stomach being seen as the person who let her boyfriend harass her ex-husband. But what struck me most wasn't the content of her message. It was the tone. Detached, cold, matter-of-fact. Like she was reporting a plumbing issue to a landlord, rather than addressing the man she'd been married to for 3 years. That night, Nathan and I split a bottle of bourbon in companionable silence. We were sitting in his living room with the television on, but the volume turned down low, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Midway through my 3rd glass, when the alcohol had loosened his tongue enough, Nathan finally asked the question I could tell he'd been holding back. "You ever think about why she picked him?" I shook my head slowly, feeling the bourbon burn in my chest. Every damn day. He leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette, taking a long drag before continuing. It's not because he's better than you. Probably not even because he's different from you. He exhaled smoke toward the ceiling and looked at me with the kind of directness that only comes from decades of friendship. People like her, they pick what they think they deserve in that moment. She wanted a cheap thrill, someone to light a fire under her ego and make her feel alive again. It's not about you, man. It never was. I wanted to believe that explanation with every fiber of my being. God, I did. But belief doesn't erase pain, and it doesn't undo the image of the person you loved looking genuinely happy in someone else's arms. It doesn't silence that persistent voice in the back of your head that whispers you weren't enough. That if you'd been different or better or more exciting, none of this would have happened. But as I sat there nursing my bourbon and thinking about Nathan's words, I started to realize something darker and more complicated. It wasn't that I wasn't enough for Victoria. It was that she had never really allowed me to be anything at all. Our entire relationship had been built around her comfort zone, her needs, her timeline, her vision of what a stable life should look like. I had been cast in the role of safe husband without ever being asked if that was the part I wanted to play. It was Friday when I finally worked up the courage to open the storage box. The one I had shoved into the back of Nathan's spare closet and tried to forget about. The box contained all the remnants of a life that now felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. There were photographs, handwritten letters, anniversary cards, and even a menu from the restaurant where I had proposed to her 2 years ago. I don't know what I expected to find when I opened that box. Maybe a clue that would help me understand how everything had gone so wrong. Maybe some kind of closure that would let me move forward. Maybe just a version of Victoria that felt real again. That would remind me why I had loved her in the first place. What I found instead was evidence, cold, hard evidence that I had been in love with someone who had never truly existed. Victoria had always been gifted with words. Her handwriting was sharp, elegant, and confident, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who had never doubted her own thoughts. In one anniversary card from our second year together, she had written, "You were my anchor in the storm, my truth in a world of noise. I could never betray what we have." That was from year 2. 4 years later, she was sneaking off to happy hours that she called team meetings and painting her nails colors she claimed to hate. I read that line over and over again. I could never betray what we have. And yet she had, easily, quietly, methodically, like brushing dust off a windowsill. I laughed out loud when I read those words again. A dry, bitter sound that startled even me. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed of how long I had held on, how fiercely I had clung to the illusion that we were something worth saving. Nathan walked into the room and took one look at the mess of photographs and letters scattered across the floor. "You sure you want to dig through all that?" he asked. I nodded without looking up. "Yeah, I think I need to." He sat down across from me and picked up a photograph from the pile. It was a picture of Victoria and me at the zoo, taken on one of those perfect Saturday afternoons that used to define our relationship. She had cotton candy in her hand. I was wearing a ridiculous hat we'd bought from a gift shop, and we both looked young, stupid, and completely unbothered by the future. "You still love her?" Nathan asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. The question felt more complicated than it should have. "I think I loved the version I thought she was," I finally said. "But that woman's gone. Or maybe she never existed in the first place. Maybe she was just a well-dressed lie with nice perfume." Nathan nodded slowly. "You're getting there." "Getting where?" "To the part where you stop bleeding." I appreciated that he didn't give me some greeting card platitude about moving on or finding someone better. He just acknowledged the process, the wound, the slow formation of a scab, the gradual healing that couldn't be rushed or forced. I spent the rest of that night burning the letters one by one in a metal bin on Nathan's balcony. I watched the edges curl black and crumble into ash, expecting to feel dramatic, like I was starring in some breakup movie montage. But it didn't feel cinematic at all, it just felt clean. Strangely, surprisingly clean. The last thing I burned was a hotel receipt I'd found tucked between the pages of one of her cards. It was dated 8 months ago and showed charges for 2 guests in one room. She had told me she was out of town for a work conference that weekend. I guess that's what we're calling adultery these days. As I watched that receipt catch fire and disintegrate, I whispered something I didn't expect. "Thank you." I wasn't thanking Victoria. I was thanking the truth. Because as much as it hurt to watch my life collapse in real time, it hurt infinitely more to live inside a fake one. Victoria hadn't destroyed a happy marriage. She had exposed the fact that there wasn't one left to destroy. And somewhere in those flames, watching the last physical remnants of our relationship turn to ash, I realized that I was finally, truly free. The next time I saw her, it wasn't planned. It was 3 weeks after I had burned the last remnants of our shared past, on a Friday afternoon that was unusually warm for late July. I had taken the day off work, partly to give myself a mental health break, and partly because Nathan had all but physically shoved me out the door that morning. "Go be a person again," he'd said, and I realized he was right. I had been existing in a kind of emotional hibernation, and it was time to rejoin the world. So I did what normal people do on Friday afternoons. I walked through the farmer's market in South Beach with sunglasses on and a cup of coffee in my hand, pretending I had a regular life again. The market was bustling with the usual crowd. Tourists taking photos of exotic fruits, locals haggling over prices, couples sharing samples of honey and artisanal cheese. That's when I saw them. Victoria was standing near a vegetable stand, her hair pulled up in a loose bun, wearing a sundress I'd never seen before. She was laughing at something, her head thrown back in genuine amusement. And beside her, holding a basket full of vegetables like he belonged in her Saturday routine, was Kevin. It wasn't a romantic moment or a scandalous public display. It was devastatingly casual, devastatingly normal. They looked like any other couple doing their weekend shopping, discussing meal plans and grocery lists. He was holding that basket like he had every right to be planning meals with my ex-wife. Like their relationship wasn't built on lies and secrecy, but on shared toothpaste and morning coffee preferences. She didn't see me at first, and for a moment I just stood there frozen. I thought I had moved past this, thought those flames in Nathan's metal bin had cauterized every nerve ending she used to be able to touch. But my chest caved in for just a second, just long enough to remind me that healing isn't always linear. Then she turned, and our eyes met across the crowded market. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised or uncomfortable. If anything, she looked smug, like she had won some contest I didn't even know we were having. I took a step forward before I could stop myself. Not toward her, but toward clarity. I needed to see this up close. Needed to understand what I was really looking at. Kevin noticed me too now. His face twitched slightly when he recognized me, probably from photographs Victoria had shown him, or maybe from that one company party where we'd shaken hands and he'd said, "Lucky guy." The irony of that comment wasn't lost on me now. Victoria leaned into Kevin and said something I couldn't hear. He laughed in response, and that small gesture of intimacy hit me like a physical blow. I walked over to them, keeping my movements calm and controlled. "Hi, Victoria," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Tyler," she replied without missing a beat. "Didn't expect to see you here." Kevin cleared his throat like he wanted to contribute something to this conversation, but I completely ignored him. He didn't deserve acknowledgement. "I see you moved on quickly," I said, keeping my tone conversational. She shrugged with that same infuriating casualness I remembered from our final argument. Time doesn't move the same when you've already checked out. There it was, another one of her perfectly crafted little needles dipped in honey, designed to make me feel like the pathetic one for still caring. "Don't worry," I said, maintaining my composure. "I'm not here for drama." "Good," she smiled, and there was something genuinely relieved in her expression. "Because you look better without it." And there was the twist, the manipulation I should have expected. She was trying to make me feel like the unhinged one, the person still clinging to something that was over, while positioning herself as the mature party who had moved on gracefully. I turned to Kevin, who had been standing there looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Hope you brought your own armor," I said directly to him. "She burns through loyalty like a scented candle." He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the directness of my comment. He glanced at Victoria, probably looking for guidance on how to respond, but she didn't flinch or rush to defend herself. "I'm not going to fight you," she said calmly. "I'm happy now." "You're a lot of things," I replied, but honest was never one of them. I turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at both of them. "One more thing." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I'm not angry anymore. That's not why I walked over here." I paused, making sure I had both their attention. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. How fast something built on betrayal can pretend to be a future. I didn't wait for her reply. I turned and walked away, each step feeling lighter than the last. She didn't call after me, didn't try to have the last word. And I didn't look back, not even once. Because I finally understood that whatever she was building with Kevin wasn't my concern anymore. It was just another story I wasn't part of, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I was genuinely okay with that. The strange thing about survival is how ordinary it looks from the outside. People expect it to be dramatic, full of epiphanies at 3 in the morning, tears in the rain, and big life resets that change everything overnight. But that's not how healing actually happened for me. It came in quiet, unremarkable moments that felt almost anticlimactic, like finding myself at the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, debating between 2 different brands of light bulbs, and realizing that for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Victoria at all. Or the morning I made coffee, took a sip, and didn't instinctively reach for a second mug out of habit. She used to take her coffee with almond oat milk, a specific brand that cost twice as much as regular milk, but that she insisted tasted better. I had continued buying it out of pure muscle memory even after I moved out of our apartment. The carton would sit unopened in Nathan's refrigerator until it expired, and I'd throw it away with a pang of something that felt like loss. But one day, I threw away that expired carton without flinching. It was such a small thing, but it felt like progress. I started taking long walks in the evenings with no particular destination in mind. Just fresh air, asphalt beneath my feet, and the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that I passed by a woman sitting on the steps outside her apartment building. She was sketching in a notebook, completely absorbed in whatever she was drawing. She looked up when I passed, smiled politely in that way people do when they make brief eye contact with strangers, then went back to her artwork. I kept walking, but for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about her face. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked genuinely unburdened. She seemed focused and present in a way that Victoria had stopped being long before she ever kissed Kevin. That night, I opened the Notes app on my phone and just started typing. I had no plan or structure in mind, just thoughts that needed to get out of my head and onto a screen where I could look at them objectively. I wasn't perfect, I wrote. I worked too much sometimes. I forgot small things that mattered to her. I was emotionally distant when I was stressed, and I could be stubborn about things that didn't really matter. But I never lied to her. I never looked at someone else like they were my escape route. I showed up every damn day, and it wasn't enough. But maybe that's not on me. I stared at those words for a long time, reading them over and over. Then I hit save instead of delete. Not backspace, not a frustrated swipe to clear the screen. Save. Because for the first time, I was acknowledging that while I wasn't blameless in the failure of our marriage, I also wasn't the villain in this story. A week later, Nathan handed me a spare key to his apartment. "Stay as long as you want," he said. "But I think you're ready." "Ready for what?" I asked. He shrugged in that casual way of his. "Something that's yours again." So I started apartment hunting. Nothing fancy or ambitious, just somewhere small, clean, and quiet. Somewhere that would be entirely mine, with no ghosts hiding in the corners or memories lurking behind every piece of furniture. During a tour of a one-bedroom apartment near Coral Gables, the leasing agent pointed toward the bedroom and said, "It's got great light in the mornings. Faces east." I walked into that empty bedroom and stood in a rectangle of golden sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt genuinely still. Not hollow or bitter or angry. Just still. Like a boat that had finally found calm water after months of being tossed around by storms. It felt like I had landed somewhere real. Like maybe finally I was ready to start rebuilding my life brick by brick alone, but whole. The day I moved into my new place, it rained. Not the heavy, dramatic downpour you see in movies, but that light, persistent kind of rain that makes the streets shimmer and fills the air with the clean scent of washed concrete. I actually liked it. It felt like the right weather for starting a new chapter, quiet, calm, and refreshingly free of drama. The apartment wasn't large, but it was mine in a way that felt revolutionary after months of living in limbo. It had hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly when you walked across them, exposed brick in the living room that gave it character, and a kitchen with just enough space for a small table and 2 chairs. I bought only 1 chair, which felt like a statement I was finally ready to make. Nathan helped me carry the boxes upstairs, and when we were done, he cracked open a beer and looked around the empty space approvingly. "You sure this place isn't too grown up for you?" he asked with a grin. I smiled back, accepting my own beer and feeling lighter than I had in months. "Nah, I think I've done enough growing up in the last few months to last me a while." He nodded and clinked his bottle against mine, understanding that this moment didn't need to be dissected or analyzed. That's one of the things I'd always appreciated about Nathan. He never forced conversations or pushed for emotional revelations. He just gave you space and waited for you to fill it when you were ready. And eventually, I was ready. I saw her again, I said. He raised an eyebrow. And? Nothing dramatic, I replied. She didn't even see me this time. She was outside her office building alone. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. Guilty conscience? Nathan suggested. I doubt it, I said. Probably just late nights with Kevin. We both laughed, but there wasn't any real venom in it anymore. Just a tired edge of irony, like we were discussing characters in a movie we'd both seen too many times. I paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at me. You ever wonder if they'll make it? Like her and him. Nathan leaned back and took a thoughtful sip of his beer. Honestly, it doesn't matter. I know, but... No, really, he interrupted gently. What they have or don't have isn't your business anymore. You're not invested in that outcome. I sighed. I know you're right. I want to know it was real, that I wasn't completely blind about who she was. Nathan looked at me with the kind of directness that only comes from years of friendship. You weren't blind, he said. You were all in. There's a difference. That observation hit deeper than he probably realized. Because I had been all the way in. The kind of committed that plans retirement trips and argues over what to name future kids and debates curtain colors because you think you'll be looking at them together for the next 30 years. I had invested everything in a future that Victoria had apparently stopped believing in long before she ever kissed Kevin. She had maintained one foot out the door while I was rearranging furniture for a life we'd never actually share. But Nathan was right about one thing. Her current situation wasn't mine to care about anymore. I was building something entirely different now. A few nights later, I lit a candle on the windowsill of my new apartment and settled into the single chair I'd bought for my small kitchen table. I sat there watching the street below, observing the evening rhythm of my new neighborhood. People were walking their dogs along the sidewalk. A couple shared an umbrella as they hurried through the light rain, and a teenager glided past on a skateboard with earbuds in, completely absorbed in his own world. The world kept moving forward, and somehow so was I. I picked up a pen and started writing again. Not a letter this time, and certainly not anything addressed to Victoria. Just a thought that had been forming in my mind over the past few weeks. Something I needed to get down on paper to make it real. You don't need revenge to heal, I wrote. You don't need closure from the person who broke you. Sometimes all you need is space and silence and time, and maybe a new place with east-facing windows. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because everything in my life was suddenly fixed or perfect, but because I wasn't broken anymore. The pieces of who I was had finally stopped rattling around loose inside me and had started to settle back into something resembling a complete person. 4 months had passed since I'd walked out of our apartment, and the pain had transformed into something different. It wasn't gone. I don't think that kind of betrayal ever completely disappears, but it had dulled into something manageable, something I could carry without wincing at every step. It was like a scar you forget about until someone accidentally brushes against it, and even then, it's more of a memory of pain than actual suffering. Victoria hadn't reached out again, not even once. No texts, no emails, no accidental, I thought I deleted your number moments when she'd had too much wine. Nothing. And surprisingly, that complete silence had become the hardest part to process. Because silence, true, committed, absolute silence, has its own weight. It makes you question everything you thought you meant to someone. There was a time when I would have bet my life that I was her person, her anchor, her safe place to land when the world got complicated. It turns out I was just the phase before she decided to become someone else entirely. But healing, I was discovering, has its own strange rhythm that you can't force or schedule. I found myself taking joy in new rituals that had nothing to do with my old life. I made coffee by the window every morning, letting the east-facing light warm my face as I planned my day. I started reading again, actual novels, not just work-related articles squeezed in between meetings. I joined a boxing gym and hit the heavy bag 3 times a week, and each punch wasn't about her or my anger or revenge. It was about me finding my rhythm, my power, my breath. One night after a particularly intense workout, I stopped at the corner store near the gym to buy a bottle of water. I stepped into line behind a woman who was frantically searching through her purse for change, growing increasingly flustered as she realized she didn't have enough cash. She turned to apologize to the cashier, clearly embarrassed, and I found myself saying, "Don't worry, I've got it," without even thinking about it. She turned to face me, surprised by the offer. She had big hazel eyes and a soft, genuine smile that reached all the way to those eyes. You sure? I nodded. Yeah, don't worry about it. We walked out of the store at the same time, and she fell into step beside me. You always pay for strangers? She asked, and there was an amused quality to her voice that made me smile. Only the ones who forget their wallets, I replied. She laughed, a real unguarded sound that felt like something clean and uncomplicated. Well, thanks. I'm Sophia. Tyler. We talked for maybe 6 or 7 minutes outside that corner store. It wasn't flirtatious or forced or loaded with subtext. It was just easy in a way that felt almost foreign after years of navigating Victoria's moods and hidden meanings. Sophia didn't ask about my past, and I didn't ask about hers. We were just two strangers in the middle of a city where everything usually moves too fast, sharing a quiet moment that felt refreshingly honest. Before we parted ways, she said, "Maybe I'll see you around." Maybe, I agreed, but I didn't force anything. I didn't ask for her number or suggest we meet for coffee. I just let the moment be what it was. Because I was learning that healing isn't always about what you start. Sometimes it's about what you're finally able to let go. Victoria was gone, Kevin was irrelevant, and the pain had developed a shape that was manageable and familiar. And me? I was still here, still breathing, still becoming whoever I was supposed to be next. Fall came fast that year. The air grew sharper, leaves began scattering across the sidewalks, and I found myself swapping t-shirts for hoodies without even noticing the transition. The world kept moving forward at its relentless pace, and somehow I was moving with it instead of fighting against the current. By then, Victoria had become something like a shadow in my memory. Not a ghost that haunted me, but just a reminder of what used to be. Ghosts actively torment you with their presence. Shadows are different. They're quick, passing, just the outline of something that once existed, but no longer has any real substance or power over you. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about her, but not because I missed her or wanted her back. It was more like trying to solve a puzzle that would never have all its pieces. I still couldn't quite grasp how someone could disappear from your life that easily, with no fight, no visible regret, no lingering attachment. She had executed a clean exit strategy like closing a browser tab, efficient, complete, and apparently without any emotional residue. But by that point, I had stopped trying to understand Victoria's psychology or motivations. She had made her choices, had chosen Kevin over me, or maybe she had simply chosen herself and her own immediate gratification. Either way, I wasn't part of the equation anymore, and I was starting to realize that I actually preferred it that way. Then something unexpected happened that would shift my perspective even further. I got a message on Instagram from a name I barely recognized. Jessica, Victoria's friend who had posted that rooftop story, the one whose casual social media documentation had ultimately exposed the truth and broken the dam of my marriage. The message was short and direct. I know it's not my place, but you deserve to know the truth. She was seeing him for almost a year. It didn't start at the party. I'm sorry I should have said something sooner. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over. Almost a year. Not the 7 months Victoria had admitted to during our final confrontation. Not 8 months, which would have been bad enough. Almost a full calendar year of betrayal happening behind my back while I made her morning coffee, booked anniversary dinners, and asked her about her day with genuine interest and care. I thought I would feel rage when I read Jessica's confession. I expected that familiar surge of heartbreak, or at least some renewed sense of betrayal. But instead, I felt absolutely nothing. It was like Jessica was telling me about a different life, describing events that had happened to a different man entirely. Because the guy Victoria had betrayed for almost a year, that version of Tyler who had trusted completely and loved without reservation, he didn't exist anymore. He had died the moment she smirked and said, "Potato, potato," in response to my pain. The man reading Jessica's message was someone entirely different, someone who had been rebuilt from scratch over the past several months. I didn't respond to Jessica's message. There was nothing I needed to say, no questions I needed answered. The truth, late as it was, didn't change anything about my present reality. It just confirmed what I had already figured out through painful experience. Victoria hadn't fallen into a mistake or been swept away by a moment of passion. She had built her betrayal deliberately, brick by brick, lie by lie, smile by smile, day after day for almost an entire year. The clarity didn't hurt anymore. If anything, it freed me from any lingering doubt or self-blame I might have been carrying. That weekend, I decided to take a drive out to the lake by myself. I sat on a weathered bench with a thermos of black coffee and watched the water move under a cloudy sky. The wind was cold, but the air felt clean, and it was exactly the kind of peace I'd been craving without knowing it. Sitting there in that quiet space, I realized something important about forgiveness. It's not about the other person at all. It's not about letting them off the hook or pretending that what they did was acceptable or understandable. Forgiveness is about putting down the weight you've been carrying, about refusing to let someone else's choices continue to define your emotional landscape. I whispered the words to the water, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but clear enough for me to mean them. I forgive you, Victoria. And I genuinely meant it. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I needed to be done carrying the burden of her betrayal. I had learned that forgiveness isn't about who merits it, it's about who needs it. And I needed to be finished with this chapter of my life once and for all. It's strange how endings feel nothing like you expect them to. There's no swelling music, no perfect parting line that ties everything together with a neat bow. Just a slow fade into something new, quiet, honest, and clean. It's been 7 months now. 7 months since I stood in that apartment and told Victoria I was done unpacking her lies. 7 months since she shrugged with that infuriating casualness and didn't chase after me when I walked out the door. 7 months since I closed that door behind me and didn't look back. I still think about it sometimes. Not about her specifically, but about that pivotal moment when you realize that someone you loved wasn't just flawed, but fundamentally false. That kind of realization doesn't crack like thunder in a dramatic storm. Instead, it seeps in slowly over time, filling all the small hollow spaces you didn't even know existed inside you. I've changed since then, though not in some obvious movie montage way. I don't have a new haircut or a dramatic physical transformation. I still drink the same cheap coffee and wear the same beat-up sneakers that have carried me through countless walks around the city. But something inside me is fundamentally different now. I speak more slowly and deliberately these days. I say no without feeling guilty about disappointing people, and I say yes only when I genuinely mean it. Most importantly, I've learned to enjoy being alone without confusing it with loneliness. There's a crucial difference between the two that I never understood before. I never reached out to Victoria again after that final conversation, and she never reached out to me either. In the end, I think we both understood that the only closure we were ever going to get was the sound of that door slamming shut behind us. And surprisingly, that turned out to be okay. Not every wound needs a witness, and not every ending requires a formal resolution. Last weekend, I ran into Sophia again, the woman from the corner store who had forgotten her wallet. She was sitting in the bookstore cafe, sipping chai tea and reading something thick and scholarly looking. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled like she remembered our brief encounter, which felt like a small miracle in a city where most interactions are immediately forgotten. I walked over and asked if I could sit down. We ended up talking for over an hour, and it was remarkably easy. We didn't discuss our past relationships or compare emotional wounds or issue warnings about our respective baggage. We just talked about books, music, and life in general. When she laughed at something I said, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not excitement or obsession or the desperate need to impress someone, but a calm, gentle warmth spreading through my chest. It hit me then that this was what healthy connection was supposed to feel like. No games, no power struggles, no loaded silences that felt like threats. Just two people being genuinely present with each other. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and really looked at myself. Not searching for flaws or damage, not cataloging the ways this experience had changed my appearance, but just to see who was actually there. And I saw him clearly. The man who had remained loyal, even when his world was being systematically rewritten behind his back. The man who had walked away not because he was weak, but because he finally understood his own worth. The man who had lost something broken and found something whole in return. I turned off the light and went to bed, sleeping soundly through the night without dreams of Victoria or lingering bitterness about what might have been. Just steady breathing, just rest, just the quiet satisfaction of a mind at peace. This morning, I woke up with a feeling I didn't immediately recognize. It took me a moment to identify what it was, but then I understood. Freedom. Pure, uncomplicated freedom from a story that was never really mine to begin with. And you know what? I think I'm finally ready to start writing a new one.